but it was about 30, 35 miles across the actual border. So that's where I picked up my tactical call sign is Hawnski, Hawnski. And I had a friend on another squadron whose name was Jerkowski, and he said, well, if you're going to fly in the East Zone, I guess we'll have to give you a Russian-sounding name. So I became Hawnski, and I've been Hawnski ever since.
Welcome to Cold War Conversations.
Massive Soviet military forces have invaded the small, non-aligned, sovereign nation of Afghanistan.
5, 2, 7, 1, 6, 6, 9, 8, 8, 3.
Poland's military leader, General Jaruzelski, urged the Polish people tonight not to demonstrate on Tuesday, the second anniversary of the founding of the banned trade union Solidarity.
And I'm here to host this final program from the German Democratic Republic for you.
In this episode, we speak with Laurie Hawn, who is a retired member of Parliament and former career fighter pilot in the Canadian Forces. Laurie has some great stories of flying the CF-104 Starfighter in Europe as part of the NATO commitment for low-level ground attack. If you like what you're hearing, then from the price of a cup of coffee a month, you can help us cover our increasing costs and keep us on the air, as well as receive a Cold War Conversations coaster, this year's sought-after household accessory. Just go to coldwarconversations.com and click on the Support the Podcast menu option. Thank you so much for our latest patrons, Christine V. Wood, John Paul Kleiner, and Stephen. So, on to the podcast. We welcome Laurie Hawn, a.k.a. Hawnski, to our Cold War Conversation. Laurie, welcome to Cold War Conversations. Delighted to have you on.
Thank you. Great to be here with you.
You've got some interesting stories, which I think we will absolutely come on to. But the first thing I wanted to ask you was, why did you join the Royal Canadian Air Force?
Well, it goes back to when I was a young boy. We lived in Winnipeg, which is in the center of the country, and we vacationed or we spent the summers on Lake Winnipeg. And on Lake Winnipeg was a RCF base named Gimli. And when we would be on the beach, doing things that 4 and 5-year-old kids did every summer, 2 or 3 times, a T-33 or an F-86 would come ripping down the beach at 4'6" in the speed of heat. And we all sort of said, that's great, need to do that. And as time went by, grew up or grew up a little bit, haven't finished yet, and went to high school and wanted to get an education. So applied to what was called the regular officer training plan, where the Air Force would pay for you to go to university, pay for you to live at home, pay you a salary along the way. So I said, that's for me. So I did that, but my intent was to join and be a pilot. So I went to first year engineering at University of Manitoba and majored in bridge and basketball, and found out at the end of the year those hadn't been on the curriculum. So at 18, I went directly into pilot training and did my training at Gimli and got my wings at 19 and carried on from there.
Right. And what did pilot training involve?
Well, we at that time, there was about a 2-year period where the very first airplane you flew was a jet. And that was the Tudor, which the snowbirds continue to fly to this day. So I came off the street, never having flown anything else, and hopped into a jet. It was a simple jet, but it was a jet. So we did about 160 hours on the Tudor. And then we went on to, in those days, the advanced training was on the T-33. And we did another, I think, 75 hours on the T-33. And then we got our pilot's wings and then went on from there. My first assignment was as a T-33 qualified flying instructor. So I did that for 2 different bases for about 4.5 years before moving on to the Starfighter, to fighter training.
Right. Okay. And the T-33, what's that more commonly known as?
T-bird. The technical name was Silver Star. There was a T-bird. There was a derivative of the F-80, which was a Korean War fighter. And there was an American T-bird and a Canadian T-bird. Ours was quite different. We had a much bigger engine. We had a Rolls-Royce Nene 10 engine with 5,100 pounds of thrust. The American T-bird had an Allison engine, which was only 3,600 pounds. So our airplane was a much better performer. I've got about 3,500 hours in that airplane over the years, and loved it. It took me an awful lot of places with you can carry a luggage carrier with golf clubs in it and a whole bunch of other things, or you can pick up, a lot of pounds of salmon or crabs or lobsters or stuff from somewhere. It was a great old airplane.
Right. And was it single seat?
No, it was a two-seater. The F-80 was a single-seater originally, but then the training versions came out as a T-33, and it was a two-seater. Okay.
And you said that you then subsequently converted onto the Starfighter.
Yeah, I flew the T-Bird as an instructor for about 4.5 years, and then converted on to the Starfighter. Flew the T-Bird for the rest of my career, even when I was flying Starfighters or Hornets, as sort of a secondary airplane. So I flew that airplane for almost 30 years, but transitioned to my first fighter with the Starfighter in 1971.
Right. Okay. And that conversion was in Canada, I believe, at Cold Lake.
In Canada, at Cold Lake, yeah, and that's our biggest fighter base in Canada. It's been the training base for Starfighters and F-18s and whatnot since about 1954.
And how different was that to fly to the T-Bird?
Well, the Starfighter was a much more difficult airplane to fly, and I sort of hesitate when I say that because it's relatively easy to fly, but it was very, very fast. Yeah, I mean, it was a Mach 2 airplane. The T-Bird was limited to Mach 0.8, so it was a big difference. The T-Bird actually had wings to turn. The 104 had little stubby things that they called wings. It would bank as if to turn, but it would go like the hobs of hell in the straight line, and it was tremendously fun to fly.
So it was really like flying a rocket rather than a plane.
Yeah, it was. It would not turn very well. The wing loading was extremely high, but the thrust was amazing. If you had a clean airplane, nothing hanging from the wings at all, on a 40 below day at Cold Lake, if you could get the landing gear up in time, you had to bring it out of afterburner at the end of the runway, or you'd be pushing supersonic, and that was on a 13,000 foot runway. So it accelerated like a demon. To get the gear up, the takeoff speed was about 180 knots in that configuration. Going through 160, you put the gear handle up. The gear wouldn't fold because there's a weight on a wheel switch that would prevent that. And then as you started to break ground, the gear would start to fold, and then you just watch the gear lights. If the lights went out before 260, then you held it down and pressed. If the lights didn't go out, well, you'd have to pull it out of burner, or you'd be tearing doors off and stuff. But if the lights did go out and you held it down, at the end of the runway, you'd be going through about 620 knots. And approaching supersonic, so it was blindingly fast.
Yeah. I've seen some footage of some West German Starfighters where they're sort of like launching them from what looked like missile launchers or something like that.
Well, there was something called the CF-104. The Germans did it. The Americans did some. It was never sort of practical. It was more of an experimental thing than anything else. But they would have a JATO style rocket on the airplane, and they would launch it from a sort of a standing start, pointed up kind of thing. And the JATO, it wasn't called JATO, but it was that kind of thing, would get the airplane going fast enough so it could fly on its own. And flying on its own in the clean configuration meant you had to be doing, about 200 knots.
Okay. And you're then posted to Europe?
Yes. We had 3 squadrons in Europe at the time in one Canadian air group. We had been much larger in earlier days. We had the Sabre in Europe and the CF-100. Then we converted to the Starfighter. We had 12 squadrons at one point with the Sabres and CF-100s. We eventually wound down to 3 squadrons of Starfighters at Baden-Solingen in what we called Four-Wing in southern Germany.
Right. And how did you fly the Starfighter to Europe, or was it shipped over? Because it's not a great transatlantic airplane. We did ferry airplanes. I didn't, but later on we did ferry some airplanes across to Europe when we were getting out of the Starfighter business, flying some of them home and so on. But that was sort of island hopping on the way. But the airplanes were in situ. The first ones went there, I want to say 64, 65, somewhere in that. So we had 54 airplanes committed. When we got down to 3 squadrons, we had 54 airplanes committed to NATO, and then we had another dozen or so there as sort of reserves. Right. And was the Starfighter intended to defend Canada as well from Soviet incursion?
No.
It was always a Canada, European plane, was it?
It was strictly a NATO asset. We had the Voodoo, the CF-101, for our primary air defense fighter in North America, but the Starfighter was strictly a NATO committed asset.
Right. And why was that? Because of its short range, or
short range, and we got into the initially with the Starfighter, we were in the nuclear strike and reconnaissance role, and the airplane was extremely well suited for that. It would have been a fine interceptor in Canada, but our airplanes didn't have a beyond visual range missile capability, which obviously you needed as an air defense fighter in North America. And the Voodoo had the Falcon, which was an IR missile, and they had the Genie, which was called the Air 2A, I think, which was a nuclear tipped air-to-air rocket, actually not a missile, but a rocket. But with the Starfighter, we were committed in Europe to the nuclear strike role and reconnaissance. And that changed in 71 or so to being conventional attack.
Prior to 71, the Starfighter was intended to launch a nuclear missile, or was it a free-fall bomb?
They were free-fall bombs of a variety of yields from little. They're all quote-unquote tactical nukes.
Mm-hmm.
I can't remember what the upper limit was. It was classified anyway. But they had various sizes of weapons. But in the generally speaking, sort of 2,000-pound weight class.
Right. Okay. And what was the training like to do that? Because obviously it must be going through your mind. This is a really different ball game to launching a conventional weapon.
For sure. I only flew the airplane in Europe in the conventional role. We trained in the nuclear role in Cold Lake, but we were sort of transitioning to conventional by the time we arrived in Europe. But the role on the nuclear strike side was single ship, lower than a snake's belly and faster than the speed of heat. And the missions most of them were probably one way, meaning you weren't going to get back to Baden or Lahr, the other bases we had at the time. Hopefully you would get back to a secure airfield, at least on our side of bad guy land. But the targets were all pre-planned. People had assigned targets, whether they were in East Germany or Czechoslovakia. There were some a little bit deeper than that. Those were definitely one-way missions, and they were. The training was intense. The training was very demanding. The ground handling, of course, of the weapons. We didn't own the weapons. The Americans owned the weapons. So they were there as the custodians of all the weapons, and there were things called no loan zones around the aircraft, and no one person could ever be inside that circle. And there's some stories about tempting the American guards. And one of our guys walked up one guy one day and said, "Private, what would you do if I stepped across that line?" And because the airplane was armed with a nuke, and a private American soldier said, "Well, I'd call my sergeant." "Why would you call your sergeant?" "Well, sir, I'd call my sergeant to haul your dead ass out of here." And they meant it. It was serious business. They didn't screw around with nukes as they shouldn't. And our guys were very, very good. They used to typically win the weapons meets over there, or do extremely well. And our recce guys were also extremely well qualified. They would routinely win what was called Royal Flush, which was the big recce competition in those days. So that was sort of the nuclear and recce role. And then, of course, things changed quite a bit when we got into the conventional role.
Right. Okay. And sorry, I'm just interested in the nuclear side, and we will get onto the conventional side as well. Presumably, if this is a free fall bomb, you need to launch it from some altitude. So are you effectively lobbing it?
Well, it was low altitude. They were all low altitude deliveries, and they had a variety of toss techniques. I mean, you would basically, everything was timed. You had timers in the airplane. You had a timer reference point that you would visually, or by radar, they could deliver them by radar as well as visually. And it was very accurate with radar as well. And you would hit the timer reference point. You'd be on speed, on track, hit the timers. And when the timers, it was programmed depending on wind speed and all the rest of that. Mm. And when the timer went off, then you would do about a 4 to 5G pull with the pickle button down. When it hit the second time, the weapon would release. There would be a big thump because you're dropping 2,000 pounds or something off the airplane, and then they would just continue to pull over the top and escape the other way.
So you're effectively almost doing a loop, not quite a loop.
You're doing, you're basically doing an immelman, a loop, and coming back and hitting 180 out from where you came. There were other types of deliveries, but that was sort of the primary mode of delivery.
Presumably, you've got goggles that protect you from the flash and things like that as well. Yeah,
they had gold. The visors were gold tinted so that you wouldn't get blinded by the flash. And ideally, of course, you'd be going the other way and not looking back over your shoulder when the thing went off.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, you were training to do that, but how did you feel about that aspect? Because I mean, that sort of weapon is pretty indiscriminate. I get it's sort of like low yield and at a military target, but it is a weapon of mass destruction.
Well, it's I mean, it was obviously pretty deadly device. I mean, obviously there were a whole bunch of other people doing the same thing on both sides of the equation, and it was just the targets were military targets. There were no, that I'm aware of, there were no sort of civilian targets at all. They were all military installations of one kind or another. And if you're there on an installation, and sorry, by definition you're a bad guy, and that's just doing our job.
Yeah.
As they would do the other way.
Yeah, no, completely understood. And you're flying very low, so you're navigating by radar or by
visually primarily, but the weather in Europe, of course, especially in those days before they cleaned up the Ruhr Valley, was pretty awful, and you were routinely in cloud. Now we had a system of radar predictions that we pioneered. Actually, a Canadian navigator pioneered it. And it was like they would develop a radar prediction. So you'd have a visual map on one side and your radar prediction on the other side of the map on your knee, and you could basically follow the radar prediction just like picking out lakes and other things. And it was extremely accurate. Now the radar maps we would fly at sort of 750 feet plus or minus 250. So you could be as low as 500 feet in cloud. Smoking along at 540 knots with a 2,000 pound nuke under your belly, and do everything without any visual reference to the ground. We got to be very accurate with that.
Wow, I mean, you've got to be I mean, at that height, you've got pylons and other stuff there as well. So you've got to be right on the button, haven't you?
You got to be on track because there's a lot of towers in Central Europe. And so we spent an awful lot of time, sanitizing the route, kind of thing. And we had safety altitudes all the way along that, if you're below that altitude, then you might be below 500 feet. The altitude would guarantee you at least 500 feet over any obstacle within, I think, 5 nautical miles of track, kind of thing.
Right. Okay.
So we spent a lot of time making sure towers were plotted properly and so on.
Yeah, somebody didn't put one up since your last trip.
And we did, before I got there, we did have a guy at night take out it was a construction crane, and the crane was up, which probably shouldn't have been, but he shouldn't have been that low. And the cable was hanging down from the crane, and he screwed up somehow, and he was below that. And what got his attention was when he hit the cable hanging down, but the wing on the Starfighter is so sharp, it sliced through the cable, and he carried on. But it got his attention, so at least he didn't hit the ground. So he brought the airplane home, and it had a gouge in the wing. But if it had been any other airplane, of course, it would have just destroyed it.
Yeah, it would have taken the wing off. Absolutely. God. Wow, lucky guy.
Yeah, you could say that.
So in the conventional,
actually his name was Guy. It was Guy Faby, but that's an aside.
That's coincidence. Good coincidence. So in the conventional role, did you know exactly what targets you were going to be hitting as well?
We did. We had pre-planned targets. There were sort of two kinds. We had what we called plan actuals, where when we exercised and so on, they'd call an alert and so on, and we'd go in and we'd plan our plan actuals, and it would, there'd be 4 ships or multiples of 4 ships. And if it was a 16 plane kind of attack, then we would the mass attack lead would get the frag and would sort of pick out the desired mean points of impact, that sort of thing, and then hand it down to each of the 4-ship leads, and they would go off and plan their own part of it, and then they would get back together and brief the whole thing. The 4 ships were simple. Obviously, 16 ships were a lot more complex, and we really started developing those by a guy named Billy Sparks from Kentucky, who was an American exchange officer, major, had been a wild weasel in Southeast Asia, had a terrific story of being shot down around Hanoi. He was, I think, the furthest north guy to ever get picked up and rescued. And he introduced, of course, they used a bunch of those tactics in Southeast Asia with the mass formations and so on. So he kind of introduced that to us, and we developed it from there. So it was we were never single ship. In that case, we were always, you operated in 2s, but always in packages of 4 normally, and then multiples of 4. And most of the targets, like I say, we had plan actuals, real targets. For exercise or training, of course, we would pick missile sites or ammo dumps or airfields or whatever to practice against. So it was all quite realistic. And there was only, well, from Baden, 150 miles or so away, there were people that wanted to kill you. So, that was the sort of environment we lived in, and we loved it. I mean, it was so much fun to fly, and there was a certain amount of intensity to it and relevance to it, because not far away were the in those days the real bad guys.
No, absolutely. So how did you, if you knew you were going to hit somewhere in East Germany, I'm assuming, was it East Germany and Czechoslovakia, the areas?
East Germany and Czechoslovakia primarily, yeah.
Okay, so you obviously can't practice that low level flying into East Germany. So how did you?
Well, I did. But
we'll come on to that.
Yeah,
we'll come on to that. But how did you allow for changes in the terrain, things like pylons and stuff like that? Because you're not going to know they've put up a load of pylons in somewhere in East Germany.
Well, there was satellite imagery and so on. So we had a pretty good idea. And, in those days, in the conventional role, it was visual. Now you could go, you could take a 4-ship in cloud in close formation, but you wouldn't cross the border like that, because you'd be a sitting duck at 500 or 750 feet. So as long as you could break out, you could fly, in cloud, the same sort of radar navigation exercises or things we did in the nuclear role, but in a close formation of 4 airplanes, and then break out visually before you get to bad guy land, and then carry on visually from there. You'd be at minimum of 500 feet in cloud before that, and after that, then you'd be down as low as you could possibly go. And generally, you cruised at 450 knots, but as soon as you hit bad guy land, you were going at least 540. And you had to have pretty good lookout, and the weather was always often pretty crappy. And we lost a number of guys, not as many as the Germans, because we were always low level, always high speed, always shitty weather, and normally always in rolling terrain. So it didn't take much of an error in judgment to come face to face with something you couldn't fly through. And I've personally had the stick buried in my lap a couple of times, saying, "Shit, I hope this works," and it always did, because I'm here. But occasionally it didn't. So it was, it was intense, and you really had to be heads up, and you had to have some discipline about looking ahead in crappy weather as to, okay, when, how far can I press this, and when do I have to, cry uncle and pull up and abort. And we lost, I think, 39 guys or something like that, who, not all of those, that specific scenario, but we lost quite a few guys in those days.
Yeah. And I think people forget about that, because, people talk about the Cold War and it being not a shooting war, but people forget, the service people that died in training accidents and, situations just described.
Yeah. Canada, I forget the exact number, but we lost upwards of 1,000 people, not flying F-8 Starfighters, but between Sabres and CF-100s and Starfighters and F-18s and Army, on the ground over there in various ways. We lost, pretty close to 1,000 people in the Cold War. So, yeah, it wasn't a shooting war, but a lot of people died nevertheless.
Were you told what to do if you were shot down or captured?
Well, you carried, we carried a kit with some East German money and some escape maps and that sort of stuff, and basically it was, get out your compass and start walking west, and stay out of sight, stay under cover, and don't travel during the day, and avoid roads, and all that kind of stuff. We also took escape and evasion training in the Netherlands, at Soesterberg, which is an American base in the Netherlands. There was an escape and evasion course that we would take there, which was, as realistic as you could make it, but it was fairly brutal and not a lot of fun. But of course, not nearly as much not fun as the actual situation would be. So, you're realistically, your chances, if you punched out over there, your chances of getting home were probably pretty slim.
The interrogation training in the Netherlands, so they were sort of effectively trying to simulate what it would be like if you were captured and what questions they would ask. And did it involve some physical roughing up? It sounds like it did.
Oh yeah. These guys were all trained interrogators, from our side, who would have, done it to the bad guys if they got captured. But they would basically starve you. They would get you up at all hours of the night and, run you through fields and just, try to wear you physically down. And then they would do the interrogation bit, and they would, they would have an escape route, or, they'd drop you off. The last part of the exercise was they would drop you off, and you had sort of 20 Ks or 25 Ks or something to go to a safe house. And they would have the army out, the Dutch army and dogs and everybody out there trying to track you down, and you'd be in pairs, and you would make it to the safe house or not. But if you made it to the safe house, then guess what? They lied. It wasn't safe at all. So they would catch you, and they would bind your hand and hobble you and tie your hands behind your back and put a bag over your head that some of the guys had bags that people had honked in, and then they would run you through the woods. And of course you're blind, so you'd be tripping and falling and whatever, and they'd do that for a while, and then they'd take you to a camp, and they would have you, still blindfolded. You knew the other guys were around because you could hear noises and stuff. And they would, put you up beside speakers and play, really loud music in your ears and so on, everything just to break you down. And they would take you in and go put you through a number of interrogations. And it was, of course, the old, name, rank, serial number, date of birth kind of thing. And they would, play all kinds of games with you, which were, realistic. And, it was just a good exposure, probably not as bad as the real one would be, but bad enough that sometimes, the one I did said, you lose track that this is just an exercise. This isn't real, and it's going to be over, in a day or two, but you get so taken up by it. And, we had one guy, a very close friend named John Bagshaw, who was a tough guy, grew up in the North in Canada. And he when it started playing the music, he started singing at the top of his lungs, and everybody else started. I wasn't in this particular one, but everybody else started singing as well, and it was driving the guards crazy. So they said, "Look, you got to stop singing. You're driving us nuts." He said, "Well, you stop singing if we take your hood off and give you a cigarette." He said, "Sure, I'll do that." So they took his hood off and gave him a cigarette, and he smoked the cigarette, and that was great. And then he started singing again. So he lied. So this went on for a while. So there were lots of games played in both ways, and it was a good exposure to just a taste of what it would really be like, and what it wouldn't be really like is not pretty. The biggest thing was hang on long enough so that whatever information they might force out of you was not going to be of any value anyway.
Yeah,
but it was it wasn't one of those fun things you got to do.
No, it definitely doesn't sound like it, but it's interesting, the detail there. I mean, if you're flying at 500 feet, the ejection seat still works and you can still parachute safely, can you?
The Starfighter had a great seat. It was called the Lockheed C2 seat, and we had 200 and I want to say round numbers 240 airplanes. We lost half the fleet over a 25-year period to accidents and so on. And I can't remember the number of ejections we had, but a lot. And the seat was extremely reliable. There was maybe one or two failures of the seat. One, a guy named, I think his name was Zimic, when he ejected, he separated from the seat and the seat tumbled. and hit him in the head and killed him. Came down dead. I think we had one other failure, but the seat was incredibly reliable. Even people who were outside the envelope. I mean, it was a 090 seat, I think. 90 knots on the ground, you'd make it. So if you were airborne, the seat always worked. Obviously, if you had a super sync rate on, that's going to eat up what the seat can do. But if you gave the seat half a chance, it always saved your ass.
Right. And what was the Starfighter like to land? What was it like at low speed?
Well, there's no such thing as low speed in the Starfighter. It was fast. I mean, the cleanest airplane, you're 170 knots over the fence, and touchdown was 150 knots. And then if you had anything on the airplane, fuel, tanks, weapons, whatever, then it went up from there. And the two-seater, we normally flew with 4 tanks, tip tanks, and pylon tanks on, and it was a pig. The takeoff speed in that one was about 220 knots. The tire speed, I think, was 239. So if you're on the ground doing 239 knots, then your tires were probably going to disintegrate. If you were doing a flapless approach in the airplane with a clean airplane, your speed on final, I want to say, was about 220 knots, something like that. So it was smoking. You didn't. There was no such thing as forced landing the airplane with the engine out. There was a procedure. I've only ever heard of one guy who did it. He actually did it twice. But if the engine quit, it was normally suicide to try to land the airplane, so you would just punch out.
Right. And was it slowed with a drogue chute?
Yes. Yeah, we had a drag chute. And that was, you couldn't have flown the airplane without it. We would do no-shoot landing depending on the length of the runway. And, if you didn't want to, because if you're away somewhere and you use the chute, well, you'd have to pack it yourself, which is a pain in the ass.
Yeah.
So you tried not to use the chute, but routinely, for routine operations, you use the chute all the time.
And did you have to practice like Autobahn takeoff and landing, or was it always from your own airfield?
No, it was always from our own airfield. We didn't do that. I mean, the airplane could have done that, but it would have used a lot more Autobahn than some other airplanes.
Yeah, but at least you got the narrow wingspan. So.
Oh yeah. Oh no, it was. You could have done it. It was not. We just never practiced that.
Yeah, yeah. And you were in. You said you had competitions and things like that. So were these competitions against the other NATO air forces?
Yeah, it was, 2 ATAF and 2 ATAF was in the north, 4 ATAF was more in the south. And there was a tactical weapons meet, an AFCENT tactical weapons meet every year. And it was sort of 2 ATAF against 4 ATAF. And in 4 ATAF, there was us and the Yanks and some Brits, and the French were invited, and the Dutch, I'm sort of hesitating, because between 2 and 4 ATAF, there was all the NATO allies. The Italians and the Turks were with us down south. So there was about generally 10 or so countries competing, and they were, all over Central Europe at various bases in Baden and all over, and they were tons of fun. I was involved in a couple of them as a chase pilot, and then organizing the one in Baden. And the Yanks had gotten a terrible beating in 1972 in Florence in Belgium, and they were kind of embarrassed. And so we were doing the next one in Baden 2 years later, and I and another guy organized a practice meet. And the main aim of that one was to, I hope not too many Americans listen to this, but one of the aims of that one was to teach the Americans how to do this, and they learned very well, and they did very well, because they were embarrassed in 72. So all that to say, it was a competition, but there was a ton of learning that went on, between the air forces, and everybody was competing hard, but ultimately we were all on the same team, so we'd share techniques and share secrets, or not secrets, but share techniques and training procedures and stuff like that. So everybody learned a lot, and they were tons of fun.
Yeah. And how were they scored? I mean, was it on the basis of being able to navigate round waypoints? And
well, it was, there was a variety. I mean, there was weapons delivery, on the various ranges.
Yeah.
And there were what we called equivalent targets, EQ targets, And those were navigation exercises where there would be a target, a little bridge or something like that, and there would be judges on the ground, and you had to be within 100 feet for max points. You had to be within 100 feet, either side, or you got 0 because you didn't hit it. And to get max points, you had to be within 3 seconds. And then beyond 3 seconds, you had points deducted. So it was pretty exacting.
Yeah,
you had to be pretty damn accurate.
Yeah,
and bear in mind you're at 540 knots, so you didn't have a lot of room for error.
No. And talking of navigation, tell me about your inadvertent flight into airspace you shouldn't be in.
Well, it was a beautiful day. I think it was September. Actually, it was September 11th. It was my own 9/11, 1972, and I'd been away on leave and came back into the squadron a day early, or came back from leave a day early and wandered down to the squadron to see what was going on, and we were doing a close air support exercise with the Belgian army up north somewhere, and showed up just to have a coffee, and a guy named Dave Burrows was sick, and the guy running the ops desk said, "Hey, Burrows is sick. Do you want a trip?" I said, "Hell yeah!" So I went and threw my gear on and got a 30-second brief, and said, "Just take this." It was called IP Orange. We had some pre-planned routes that would get us partway to wherever, and then we would have cut and paste maps after that. He said, "Take IP Orange, climb to 5,000 feet, talk to the FAC on this frequency. He'll vector you in, do some runs, and come home." He said, "Well, that's a no-brainer." So I did that, and climbed to 5,000, talked to the FAC, went in, did a bunch of runs on some Belgian armor, and then he said there's some USAF F4s coming behind, so you need to clear the target area eastbound before turning south. I didn't realize two things. One, my inertial nav system, which wasn't very reliable in the 104 anyway, and I hadn't paid any attention to it because it was a beautiful day, didn't need it. It had developed a terminal error of 090 for 150 miles, which meant that it thought home base was somewhere actually over in Czechoslovakia. The other thing I didn't realize was that the target area was already inside the buffer zone. Are you familiar with the buffer zone, the old buffer zone?
No, I'm not.
There was the political border, and there was a buffer zone of 10 miles. And the only people that were allowed to fly in the buffer zone were the Germans, the Americans, the Brits, and the Canadians, because, we were supposedly, above average. What I didn't appreciate was the target was already inside the buffer zone. So I was within 10 miles from the border. And when they said exit the target area eastbound before turning south, well, I turned east. And I had a quick look and at my nav system. So, okay, I'm just going to I was at 5,000 feet, squawking. I wasn't hiding from anybody. And I said, okay, I'm going to do what was called a bit of a point-to-point, and I'll find the end of IP Orange and then just follow it backwards home. So I launch off eastbound, doing a rough point-to-point to what I thought was off of Baden. In fact, it was off of somewhere in Czechoslovakia. So I'm heading eastbound, and I've got lots of extra gas, and I'm just sort of wandering around looking for somebody to play with. Everybody used to bounce everybody over there all the time.
Yeah. So
I'm looking for somebody to play with, and not finding anybody, and the terrain is not looking like it did around the end of IP Orange. I said, okay, there's something wrong here. So I climbed to 20,000 feet, turned west, tuned in the Frankfurt TACAN, which is a nav aid, and it said 070 for 95 miles. And I said, whoa, that's not where I thought I was. But if you did stray over there, then there was our air defense guys were monitoring you all the time. And if they saw somebody going a bad place, they would come up on guard and declare a brass monkey. Cedar Mine declares a brass monkey, aircraft, yada, 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 turn 240 and leave. And if you heard that and you weren't 100% sure where you were, then they might be talking to you. So you would turn 240 and go like hell.
Right. And brass monkey was sort of like the code word for...
Brass monkey was a code word for you're the wrong place, a-hole, and get out of there.
Right.
And they might be talking to you. And I thought, because I hadn't heard any of that, I was high, I was 20,000 feet, and I was squawking. And I thought, the eastern border used to take a jog to the east before Czechoslovakia and then turn south. I thought, geez, I must be down in that corner, because somebody would have said something. So I blithely motored at 20,000 feet and heading west towards Baden. And just by Frankfurt, the two American Phantoms jumped me, which was not, they weren't very aggressive in those days, the Americans, but they jumped me. And I said, no, you jerk, now I don't have any gas to play. I'm just going to have to go home. So we just went to, 0.99, just subsonic, and sort of ran away and did some big clearing turns and didn't see them anymore. I said, okay, that's fine. So I let down into Baden. It was a beautiful day. And as I was approaching initial, something sort of caught my eye, and I looked, and this American Phantom was coming out from underneath me, and looked further back, and there was another one there about 2 or 3 miles back, a couple thousand feet high. And I said, I wonder where 070 for 95 from Frankfurt really is. And ironically, the call letters in the back of the airplane were AH, which is for Hawn Air Force Base, which I thought was a little ironic. They spelled it differently, but it was the same pronunciation. So I, said, I think something was wrong there. So I landed, taxied, and went to the map and took out the string and plotted 070 for 95 from Frankfurt. And I was basically in the traffic pattern of Erfurt, which was one of their big MiG-21 bases at the time. And I should have done touch and go. So anyway, the shit hit the fan, and of course, wing ops called and said, where were you just now? I said, I was just, I've been here all day reading emails. but so the gig was up, so I got a reproof. It was called for negligence in mission planning, which was true. I hadn't done any. And but what we found out afterwards is that it wasn't the air defense guys that caught me coming back. It was Rhine radar, which is a civil radar. And these two American Phantoms just happened to be going cross country. And the Rhine controller saw a high-speed target coming out of the East Zone, asked these Yanks if they cared to identify. And they said, hell yeah, that's more fun than going cross country. So they chased me down and found out from my friends in our radar guys that, of course, I was just subsonic. Said, no, they were doing about 1.4 to catch you, because, of course, at that point, they didn't care about making noise.
Yeah.
But what transpired was our air defense guys had not seen me going or coming back, and their guys had not seen me coming. They saw me as I was turning by Erfurt, and they scrambled after me, but I was, out of their area by that time. But I was about 30, 35 miles across the actual border.
Wow.
And so so that's where I picked up my tactical call sign is Hawnski, Hawnski. And I had a friend on another squadron whose name was Jerkowski, and he said, well, if you're going to fly in the East Zone, I guess we'll have to give you a Russian-sounding name. So I became Hawnski, and I've been Hawnski ever since.
Brilliant. That's a brilliant story.
Actually, it's a bit of a sequel to that. And 2 or 3 years later, I'm back in Cold Lake flying with Starfighter, and we're down at Luke Air Force Base just for a weekend with some airplanes. And Friday night in the bar, chatting up this guy, American pilot. I said, "Oh, what are you doing?" His name was Jay Calloway. And he said, "Oh, where you been? What you done?" Kind of thing. He said, "Oh, he flew F4s in Europe." I said, "Where?" He said, "Hawn." I said, "When were you there?" And he gave me the dates. And I said, "This is a long shot, but you didn't by any chance, intercept the 104. And he said, "Was that you?" I said, "Was that you?" And he said, "Yeah." I said, "I told him I thought you were German." I said, "Yeah, bullshit. You were flying on my wing, and I was landing in Baden." So there. He eventually retired as a 3-star, and I didn't.
Oh, and so presumably your air defense guys got a real rocket as well.
Oh, I was told that an American half colonel lost his job, and there was some shit to pay because obviously it was my fault, but they were. I put it off. I just did a tactical evaluation of the air defense system, theirs and ours, and they both failed.
Yeah. Presumably they didn't see any indication of the MiGs scrambling or anything like that at that point.
Well, this was all after the fact when they went back, I guess, and looked at tapes and so on. But I was at 5,000 feet going and 20,000 feet coming back. I was squawking, like a big dog. So I wasn't hiding from anybody.
Yeah.
So they were really asleep.
Yeah. Both sides. Wow.
Yeah, exactly.
So when do you finish in Europe? When do you go back to Canada?
Well, I came back in '75 and went back to Cold Lake and instructed on the Starfighter at the Operational Training Squadron. Did that for about 2.5 years and went off to be part of the new fighter aircraft program in Ottawa, which eventually resulted in us buying the CF-18. Right. And I flew the CF-18 till I retired in '94.
Okay, and the CF-18 is also known as
the Hornet.
The Hornet. Yeah.
The Hornet.
Right. Yeah. Got it. Okay. Sorry.
And we flew that airplane in
numbers.
Yeah, no worries. And we flew that airplane in the Cold War in Europe after the Starfighter until we finally left there. Yeah,
because I read some of the there was a high sort of casualty rate from flying the Starfighter because it was a
there was, and again, that's a relative term. We didn't lose nearly as many airplanes as the Germans. The media nicknamed it the Widowmaker, which was, that came from the German experience, not ours. You would not find any Canadian who flew the airplane or worked on it who didn't love the airplane. If you parked a Starfighter and an F-18 side by side and gave me my choice, I'd get into the Starfighter. Not to go to war in, because the F-18 is vastly more capable, but just to go fly. It was so damn much fun. And it was a very safe airplane. You had to respect it. It had a flight envelope that if you didn't respect it, it would bite you in the ass. But as long as you respected it, it was, I never had a serious emergency in almost 2,000 hours in the airplane. I never had anything resembling a serious emergency. I almost died a few times, but it was always me, not the airplane. So, no, I absolutely loved the airplane, and I don't know anybody who flew the airplane who didn't love it.
Right. And when you retired in 94, what rank were you then?
Lieutenant Colonel.
Right. Okay.
I had a command of an F-18 squadron, which was, for a fighter pilot, that's kind of the pinnacle is commanding a fighter squadron. And I got to do that, which was the best job I'll ever have in my life. And I spent 10 years as a member of Parliament, but that's a sorry second compared to commanding a fighter squadron.
Easier to manage, are they?
Yeah, way easier.
And sorry,
way more fun.
The F-18 squadron, was that based in Canada as well?
It was based in Cold Lake, but our role when I was CO was rapid reinforcement to Germany, to NATO. So we would deploy the squadron a couple of times a year and fly out of Baden-Loire. We'd take about 2/3 of the squadron, 3/4 of the squadron at any one time. So we spent a lot of time in Europe, a lot of time over the Atlantic, air refueling, back and forth. So it was tons of fun.
Yeah. And were you also flying intercepts against any of the Tu-95s and things like that, or not?
Yes. Now, I didn't personally. When I was commander of the squadron, we were strictly a NATO squadron with a secondary air defense role. As time went by, then it became totally dual role air defense, and we were air defense in Europe when we were there. But in Canada, we were training for Europe. But we did get involved in the Bear intercepts along with the other squadrons in Canada. I did a couple when I was actually a staff officer, but in North Bay, but flying the F-18 in Bagotville with one of the squadrons there. I did a couple of them there, but we would launch to Gander in Newfoundland because we would have intel that the bears were coming, and they would generally be transiting down to Cuba or back, kind of thing. So I never got to actually do an intercept. We deployed to Gander a couple of times, but the buggers turned around every time, which they would do from time to time. They would just turn around and go back. So you never actually knew. But our guys did a lot of intercepts on bears, either off the north or the Arctic or off the East Coast. Yeah.
No, we still have them flying into or towards the UK even now. Same aircraft.
Well, they still do the GI UK gap thing.
Yeah. So
you guys are doing that a lot, and our guys do when we have guys. I don't think they're there right now, but we're part of the. I forget what they call the exercise, but we'll fly out of Iceland as part of the air defense in that area. We'll do that on a rotational basis. So when our guys are there, then if the Bears are playing, then they're playing with them as well.
Yeah. And are you still involved in the Air Force and museums and preservation and things like that?
I am. Since I got out, I've been the honorary colonel for a couple of squadrons, Air Force squadrons. I'm involved somewhat with the museum here in Edmonton. I'm still involved with Air Force issues, with our next generation fighter and things like that. So I stay pretty involved, and I'm close to the senior leadership, some of whom I'd like to be close to and some of whom I'd rather be further away from, but that's always the case.
Right. That's the senior leadership of Canadian politics you're talking about there, or military?
No, I'm talking about the Air Force or the military.
Oh, okay. Okay.
Well, and politics also, but that's a different story.
It's not really part of our remit on this podcast, but you being a member of Parliament must have, that's a whole second career in itself.
Oh, it was, and it's still the second best job I'll ever have. Nothing will top flying fighters, but it was a hell of an opportunity to. We were in government. I was fortunate enough that my whole time our party was in government. I was there with Prime Minister Harper, and I got to do a lot of stuff that most people would never get to do. Spent a lot of time in Afghanistan. I was what we called the parliamentary secretary to the Minister of Defense, and we were heavily into Afghanistan at that time, as you guys were.
Mm-hmm.
And so was there 7 times, a bunch of Christmases, and spent a lot of time doing that, and just being involved in defense and security and public safety issues. But my favorites were being involved in the defense issues.
No, I can imagine. Laurie, is there any other great anecdotes that we've not covered? I don't think you've probably got any to beat the Czech airspace one, but
that one was probably one of the better ones. I mean, there's lots of stories of shenanigans in the mess and so on, but actually we had one when I was flying Starfighters, and we did squadron exchanges every year with other NATO squadrons, and we did one exchange with 14 Squadron at Bruggen. It was a Phantom Squadron, RAF.
Mm-hmm.
And so we were up there with a bunch of Starfighters, and Friday night we all trundled off to Wildenrath, which is another RAF base, for beer call. And so, as I think Brits love singing bar songs and playing the piano and burning the odd piano. And so we're all gathered around the piano in the mess in Wildenrath, and somebody's banging away on the piano. We're singing, drinking songs, and we thought, well, clearly this piano is here to be burnt. So we, very stealthily, sort of sidled the piano to the side door and, proceeded to take it outside. And the Brit tradition is you have to beat the piano to death with a steel beer keg into small enough pieces that will pass through a toilet seat. So, and then you burn it. So we proceeded to do that, and we had some help from some of the Brits who were around, and so we proceeded to do that and pass it through a toilet seat. And somebody found some gasoline or something. We lit this thing on fire, and guys were kind of leaping through the fire, some with less clothes on than others, and we're all having a good old time. And the Brit Air Commodore, who was the station commander, sidled up to our squadron commander and said, and he was a lieutenant colonel. He said, "Well, Colonel Hutt, I understand your squadron fund is rather flush at the moment." And Hutt said, "Well, no, sir. Actually, we're quite broke." He said, "Oh, that's a shame. You see, that's not our piano. it belongs to the NAFI, and they're using it in their little theater performance tomorrow night." And our CO said, "Well, sir, I'm afraid they're not." So we paid, I think it was £5,000 or some silly amount of money we had to come up with to pay for the piano. But 2 weeks later, 14 Squadron visited us in Baden, and we happened to have 2 grand pianos. Theirs was an old upright piano.
Yeah.
We had 2 grand pianos in the mess. And of course, tit for tat, they decided they would return the favor. So fortunately, we had a new one and a slightly older one. Fortunately, just by the luck of the draw, they picked on the older one. So they proceeded to, push the grand piano out to the parking lot and set it on fire. Of course, grand pianos, the wood there is really, really hard, so it burns with a lot of heat. So this thing was on fire, and everybody was having a good time. And the fire guys arrived, of course, and they said, "Okay, we're just going to monitor this." And it burned so hot that it collapsed the parking spot. It happened to be the base commander's parking spot that this thing was burning in, and it collapsed the concrete. So there's this big hole with this remains of this burnt piano in the bottom of it. So they had to pay for that one. That was fine. So we were all even. I mean, there's tons of stories like that about just the shenanigans that went on that were, property was damaged, but everybody paid up for what they did. It didn't break anything maliciously. I mean, you could call that malicious, but we kind of called it fun.
Yeah.
But you didn't break anything that was irreplaceable.
Yeah. Yeah. Presumably the grand piano was far more expensive than a stand-up then.
Oh yeah. Yeah. So they one-upped us, but that was okay. And I mean, there's tons of stories like that that went around.
Yeah.
And that was the fun. I mean, the stuff you'd be in jail for today that was just commonplace. I mean, I am going to write a book. People have bugged me to write a book for years, and I have to get off my ass and do it. And it's going to have, a military side and a political side. But the title is going to be, it seemed like a good idea at the time. Because so many things seemed like a good idea at the time.
Yeah.
On a Friday night. And then Monday morning, when you're in front of the CO with your hat off and your heels together, Captain, that was really stupid. Yes, sir, I won't do that again. Well, until next Friday.
How did you get on with the Germans and the Dutch and the others? Did you get up to similar shenanigans with them?
Well, it was mostly us and the Brits, because we're kind of, a little bit cut from the same cloth, so to speak.
Allegedly.
The Dutch were a lot of, allegedly. The Dutch were a lot of fun. The Germans were a little more, tight-assed would be a word. But they had some good guys too. I met some terrific, like, wartime people. Adolf Galland and Gunter Rahl.
Oh wow!
They would come as guest speakers at Messner. Gunter Rahl was one, and I forget how many kills he had. It was 275 or some ridiculous number. And guest speaker. It was in the early 70s, so it wasn't all that long after the war. And of course, he told some great war stories. And afterwards, after the dinner, of course, everybody's in the bar hanging around and chatting. You knew where Rahl was because there was this cluster of fighter pilots around him, just hanging on whatever he said.
Yeah.
I mean, regardless of who was on which side, in the Second World War, it didn't matter anymore.
Yeah.
And these guys were guys with unbelievable experience to share, and they were happy to share it. So we got along, with everybody really over there. But us and the Brits, I say we're pretty similar.
Yeah. Well, Rahl, I think most of his kills were over the Eastern Front as well. They were.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I forget he was shot down multiple times, as most of them were. But Eric Hartmann lived not too far from Baden, where we were stationed, and he was at a dinner. And he's long since gone now, but he had 352 kills. He was the number one guy. So to get to meet guys like that, even just casually, in the same room and listening to them, was pretty special.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think Galland was right at the end. He was in command of a ME-262 squadron in Austria, wasn't he? So he was flying jet, right.
He was one of the first jet commanders.
Yeah. Wow. Fascinating stuff. Laurie, I have taken enough of your time this evening.
No, it was a pleasure. I always enjoy talking about what was, the best part of my life.
Yeah, no, and I'm delighted to hear your story. I mean, it means so much more when you hear it, sort of firsthand like that, when you hear it with somebody's voice rather than from the page. And what I'm trying to do is capture these stories and, make people aware of almost the hidden sacrifices that occurred during the Cold War.
Well, there was an awful lot. And I mean, my own logbook, I went back a while ago and I counted, I think, 39 or 40 friends that were lost over the years. Not all in the Cold War, other training accidents, whatever. But yeah, there's a price to pay. The old story, freedom isn't free.
Yeah,
and we can't forget that.
Yeah, no, absolutely. That would be a very good note for us to finish on. Well, that's all we had time for. However, there's more information in the show notes, which are at coldwarconversations.com/episode and the number 63. If you like what you're hearing in the podcast, you can really help us by leaving reviews on iTunes, Stitcher, our Facebook page, or with your favourite podcast provider. It really helps to raise our profile and get new guests on the show. If you can't wait for the next episode, do visit our Facebook discussion group where our guests and listeners just like you continue the Cold War conversation. Just search for Cold War Conversations on Facebook. We're also on Twitter at Cold War Pod. Thank you very much for listening. It is really appreciated. Goodbye.